Good morning, everybody. How are you doing? Dr. Roddenberry coming to you from Willow Springs, 1 mile from the Lowe's grocery store. How's everybody doing today? Good to see you, Shimei. Good to see you, Imani. Good to see you, Clara. And always good to see you too, Marwa. Thanks for coming today. I had a great time at the webinar last night. Thanks to those who came. I hope you had as good a time as I did. Imani, I absolutely love your daughter and the fact that she likes Dr. Roddenberry. She's just the coolest ever. So thanks for bringing her last night. I thought that was kind of cool. Hello, Andrea. How you doing? Good to see you. Thanks for coming today. Wow, good crowd. We've got 7 people here for the live lecture. Man, don't I feel like a D-list YouTube star? Holy cow, whoop, whoop, 7 students. All right. Everybody doing all right today? You know, today's a big day. Discussion boards are due. And hi, John. Today at 11:59 p.m. If you came to webinar last night, that you are done for the you've already done the collaboration. But if not, you're going to want to make your first post on the discussion board today. It was awesome. She loved it too. Cool. Excellent. You know, for the rest of you, if there's ever a time when you want to bring a brother, sister, friend, or parent, I have family members in the webinars all the time. And so, you know, I'm willing and interested in interacting with anybody you want to bring to class. So please feel free to do that. Wow, we're up to 10 people. That's great. I want to thank you again for coming. And for those of you who just logged in, I want to tell you, remind you to do your first discussion board post. That's due tonight at 11:59 p.m. Okay, cool. Well, let's see. So here we go. Let's go ahead and switch to the PowerPoint presentation. All right. So today we're going to talk about the second half of chapter 1. Now, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to try to give you an appreciation for the different perspectives that we have in developmental psychology. Good morning, Juanita. Thanks for coming today. Now, if you remember yesterday, I told you that developmental psychology is actually an interdisciplinary study. We have sociologists, we have anthropologists, we have psychologists, we have geneticists, all of these different people who are interested in trying to understand and explain the process of growing up and developing that human beings go through. And all of these people are going to come from what we call different theoretical perspectives. Theoretical perspective. Now, a theoretical perspective, just let's see. You know what? Actually, theoretical perspective. Just a general way of viewing the world. Okay? So, what do you think is the most important thing that affects people's behavior and their development? And there are going to be many different theoretical perspectives or directions by which people come in to try and understand the process of human development. Okay, and it's important over the course of this semester, we're going to talk about these different perspectives, but chapter 1 just kind of introduces you to all of these perspectives at one time. Don't worry if not all of these perspectives make sense or are clearly defined. As we go through the rest of the semester, you will begin to understand the difference between these theoretical perspectives or ways of looking at the world. Good morning, Ronique. Glad to have you. Thanks for dropping in. So a theory is a set of interrelated postulates that explain and organize a set of observation. So if I have a reason why something happens, I am giving you a theory. Okay, so if I take this book right here and drop it and it falls down, I can explain to you why that happened because I'm going to use the theory of gravity, right? So there's a theory of gravity, and that helps us understand why things fall to the ground, right? And so a theory is basically just a set of beliefs that help to explain and organize a set of observations. Science needs theories because theories sort of direct the kind of research that we do. They provide a direction for our research. So an observation might be apples fall from trees, and if you throw a ball up into the sky, it will fall back to earth. So what's a theory which would explain both of those occurrences? Well, we have this theory of gravity. Bigger masses draw smaller masses to them. And that theory explains a different set of observations. All right. So what you're going to discover over the course of this semester is that there are several different theoretical traditions that are used to explain why humans act the way they do. So there's one theory which explains why objects fall to the ground, but there are 5 or 6 or even more than this different theories that explain why people develop the way they do. And each one of these theoretical traditions has a different explanation on why and how people develop the way they do. I see that we've spun up to 13 observers now, and D. Lau's here. Thanks for coming, D. Lau. I appreciate that. So what I'd like to do is sort of, and this is going to sound familiar to you if you went to an introductory class. I'm going to be talking about the same kinds of theories that you learned about in your introductory class. So this should be, do they all fall under nature or nurture? Great question, John. No, they do not. Some of these theories are more nurture based, and some of these theories are more nature based. That's a great question. A theory takes a viewpoint about what causes something to happen. So, for example, the psychodynamic theory is a nurture based theory that says people grow and change because of things that happen to them early in their life. That's a nurture based theory. On the other hand, this ethological theory uh, looks at evolutionary forces and how they affect people's behavior. So you can say that the ethological is more of a nature-based theory. That's a great question, though, and that allows me to point out the fact that theories allow us to take stands on these different debates. Is it more nature or is it more nurture? Well, it depends on your theoretical tradition, your theoretical perspective. Great question. Did that make sense to everybody? I'm staring at a camera right now. So I can't see you. So I can't see if you're quizzical or if you're going, I get it. When you teach a class, you can see students and you can tell when they're confused, but I can't tell that. So every once in a while, type it, I got it, or I'm confused, Dr. Roddenberry, and I can help you. That's cool, D. I'm glad to have you one day as opposed to no day. Get it. There you go. Ronika always gets everything. The guy's clever. Okay, so we're going to talk about chapter 1 talks about 5 different perspectives that we're going to focus on this semester. Have any of you ever heard of cognitive? Have any of you ever heard of behaviorism? Have any of you ever heard of psychodynamic psychology and Freud? These are all theoretical traditions that have a viewpoint on why people grow up the way they do. So what I want to do is really quickly is go through and introduce these 5 different traditions to you so you kind of have an appreciation for the different viewpoints. These are all just different ways of looking at the human being from different angles to figure out why people develop the way they do. Okay, so let's talk about the psychodynamic perspective. Okay, the psychodynamic perspective was pioneered by a fellow named Sigmund Freud. He actually he called it psychoanalytic theory. That's different than psychodynamic. So psychodynamic is a broad tradition and psychoanalytic is one tradition within that. But Sigmund Freud can be considered to be the first developmental psychologist because he asked the question, how do people's personality develop? what causes people to develop their personalities. Now, his theoretical tradition is a little bizarre, okay? But it does represent a viewpoint on why people turn out the way they do. And what Sigmund Freud argued was that people have this energy, this instinct to propagate. So we all have this thing called a sexual instinct. Yes, it was John. His perspective. He was sexual. In fact, people who disagreed with him, he threw them out of his camp because he thought everything went back to sex. I know Andrea's laughing here. I know Freud's silly, but he has a perspective on personality. So he thinks that we have this instinctual flow in us, this libido, and he argues that this libido, this sexual energy, is shaped by our early interactions with the world. And he argued that our early interactions create this personality, actually create our conscience, which is he called our superego, and it also developed our conscious personality or our ego. So, yes, when we do talk about Freud and the psychodynamic perspectives, a lot of times we're going to be talking about sex. But more importantly, what we're talking about is conflict. You see, I have it bolded in the middle of the bulleted points for Freud. The psychodynamic perspective says that people's personality is a function of how they deal with environmental conflict that they have. Psychoanalytic theory, parts of it. Okay, when you go to a clinical psychologist, they may talk about repression, repressed memories. We may talk about defense mechanisms. People manage conflict, causes interpersonal anxiety, causes you to feel anxious, and people deal with this anxiety different ways. So clinical psychologists will use a little bit of Freud, but really Freud's kind of fallen out of favor. That's a great question. Oh man, sounds like you folks know more than me about Freud. Yes, Freud was definitely, he was a rock star and very famous because he sort of repudiated these Victorian values. Yes, he said everybody was a dirty sexual being looking to have sex. And the only reason we didn't was because we were embarrassed and afraid to get in trouble. But he said that that sexual desire is lurking beneath the surface always. All right. Now, you're not going to use Freud, but I will tell you Erik Erikson will be featured heavily throughout this semester. I won't really talk about Freud, but I will talk about Erik Erikson. If any of you are nursing students, do we have any nursing students in here? If you're a nursing student, type in the chat bar. One of the things I found out by talking to former students who go into the nursing program here at Wake Tech is that they spend a lot of time talking about Erik Erikson's stages of personality development. Now, Erik Erikson thought that people's personality was determined by the way they dealt with conflicts or crises in their life. Now, these crises weren't all sexual. In fact, he didn't think any of them were really sexual. But he argued that people go through these different crises or conflicts where they have to learn important lessons. Have any of you ever heard the term called an identity crisis? Have you ever heard of anybody having an identity crisis before? Anybody ever heard that phrase? The term identity crisis was coined by this fellow named Erik Erikson. And an identity crisis isn't a bad thing. It's like a crossroads where you try to figure out what kind of person you are going to be. And he argued that everybody goes through an identity crisis during our teenage years as we try to decide who we are. So, what's my sexuality? What's my intellectual interest? What kind of person am I? Am I a Democrat, a Republican? Am I a communist? Am I a fascist? Am I gay? Am I straight? Am I an athlete? Am I a scientist? All of us go through this period in our teenage years where we're trying to figure out who we are. There you go. Shemaine's a pre-nursing. Okay, Check it out. Shemaine is actually, she has resolved her identity crisis. Shemay knows she wants to be a nurse. Are any of you out there still trying to figure out what you want to be as a profession? If you are still having a little bit of an identity crisis. John Bear says after he broke his back, he went through one because your identity was criminal law enforcement athlete, and I could no longer practice those virtues. Awesome, awesome, awesome point. Uh, and that's sort of a complication that we'll talk about a little bit later. He argued that we go through these crises at very predictable times. All of us go through an identity crisis at 18. However, if something important happens in your life, so for John, when he broke his back, he lost his job and his athletic prowess. So John had to figure out a new identity. So he actually went back and had, quote, an identity crisis. Now, people think of crisis as a bad thing. Eric Erickson didn't mean it was a bad thing. For him, he think of a crisis as a task, a time when you are given a question and you have to figure out the answer to that question. Okay? And he argued that human beings are spending their entire life creating a sense of identity. And they do that by resolving 8 crises. And these crises happen at different times in their life. So we all have a task we have to figure out as an infant. Then we all have a task we have to figure out as a toddler. Then we all have a task we have to figure out as a preschool kid. Then we all have a task we have to figure out in elementary school. Then we all have to figure out our identity in the teenage years. Then all of us have to figure out how we're going to build romantic relationships. And then all of us have a task where we try to decide whether or not we are contributing to the world and making the world a better place. And then when we're ready to die, our task is to go back on our life and see if we are satisfied with the way we live our life. Yes, John, he definitely believed in adolescence. He's actually different than Sigmund Freud. We talked about stability and change the other day. According to Freud, your personality develops, changes through your first 10 years of life, and then becomes stable and never changes. Eric Erickson would have differed than him on that stability change thing. Eric Erickson said you are always changing throughout your life. Ooh, Andrea, or who we are after a pandemic. Brilliant, brilliant. You're right. We all had to redesign our identities. We all went through sort of an identity crisis. Brilliant, brilliant. And more importantly, he says that if you are successful at resolving a crisis, you develop a virtue, or he called it a virtue. Don't think of it morality. Think of it as a strong, a positive personality quality. What are some examples of a sense of hope is a virtue, a sense of industry is a virtue, a sense of intimacy is a virtue. So we develop these virtues as we go through life. Why is this important for nursing? Well, you nurses are going to deal with people in different stages of their life. And each of these people are going to have things that they're facing that are not related to you as a nurse, but are still going to affect how they respond to your treatment. So your teenagers are going to be trying to figure out who they are. Your older adults are going to be worrying about their family and taking care of people and their legacy. And so each of your patients, if you use Erickson's theory, you can sort of understand what's going on inside the person's personality. So what we're going to do over the course of the semester, when we get to infancy, I'm going to tell you about the first personality stage. When we talk about early childhood, I'm going to talk about the second personality stage. And we're going to go through and we're going to keep revisiting Eric Erickson over the course of the semester. And we're going to talk about the crises or psychosocial tasks that each one of us have to resolve at different points in their life. Now, I have an identity. I'm a psych professor and a family man, et cetera, and a loyal Tar Heel, hoorah, okay? But right now, the task that I'm facing, the crisis that I'm having is, does my life matter? Am I building a world and making the world better for my children? Are my children a good legacy for me? Are they a great demonstration of who I am as a person? So I'm going through a different psychosocial task than you are, Andrea, or John, or any of you other younger students. So I would expect all of you are going through probably either the identity or the intimacy crisis right now. You're either trying to figure out who you are, or you're kind of interested in creating a community of friends, or maybe finding a lover or spouse. So those two things are going to probably most important to those of you who are 18 or 20, or in your teens or 20s. Okay, so one way that we're going to look at human beings over the course of this semester is we're going to think about the different predictable crises that people go through at different ages as their personality evolves. That's one perspective on the human being we're going to look at this semester. Now, we're also going to spend a lot of time talking about how people's mental abilities develop. If you were in my class, we talked about cognitive psychology, and I told you that human brains and human minds are sort of like computers. We process information, and we're similar to computers in some way, and we're different from computers in another way. One way we're going to attack the development of a human being is we're going to talk about how this computer develops as we grow older. What happens to our processing ability? What happens to our random access memory, our RAM, the number of things we can think about at one time? What happens to our long-term memory or our computer storage? How do these mental abilities develop as we get older? And so what we're going to talk about is the cognitive perspective. Okay, now two people who are very important who I'm going to introduce you to over the course of this semester are Jean Piaget and a Russian who was a Swiss developmental psychologist, and a fellow named Lev Vygotsky, who is a very, very famous Russian psychologist. There are lots of really cool Russians in psychology. We'll talk about them over the course of this semester. Jean Piaget is sometimes seen as the most important psychologist ever because he's been cited and referenced in scientific articles more than any other psychologist ever, including Freud. Okay, and so he's thought of as the most important psychologist of all time. Now, he had a theory where he explained how human beings go from not knowing anything to knowing everything. So if you think about it, if you've ever been around an infant or a baby, they don't know anything, man. They don't know how to speak. They don't really know where to look. They don't know how to hold their hands. They don't know how to do anything intellectually. How do kids go from nothing to the brilliant students that I see right in front of me today? Piaget's theory of cognitive development explained that. And he argued that human beings develop these things called schemes or plans. Now, we learn our first schemes accidentally. So I learned that when I suck on mom's breast or the bottle that she gives me, my stomach feels warm and good and my hunger goes away. And so my first plan, my first scheme as an infant, the first thing you learn as an infant is that if you put something in your mouth and suck on it, it's going to make you feel better. And have you ever noticed infants love to suck on pacifiers and little babies suck on their thumb? Why do they do that? Piaget would argue is that they accidentally learned that sucking on things makes their hunger go away. That's a scheme. And he argued that these kids then act like scientists, finding out where that scheme works and where that scheme doesn't work, right? So sucking on a pacifier, sucking on a thumb, sucking on a breast or a bottle makes me feel good. Sucking on a pile of dirt doesn't make me feel good. So I learn where I can use this scheme, I can assimilate it to different situations, and I can find out where this scheme doesn't work. I can accommodate. And he argued that human beings evolve through these four intellectual stages as they grow up. We're going to visit Piaget several times this semester, and we're going to talk about how human beings evolve and how their mental abilities evolve. So in infancy, we're in chapter 5, I think it is, we're going to talk about cognitive development in infancy. We're going to talk about Piaget. Then when we get to early childhood, we're going to talk about the second stage of cognitive development. Then when we talk about middle childhood, we're going to talk about Piaget's third stage of cognitive development. And then when we get to the adolescence, we're going to talk about the fourth distinct stage of reasoning ability as described by Piaget. Now, Piaget was a naturist, excuse me. John was asking about the relationship of these theories to nature and nurture. Piaget was a naturist. He thought our brain organized through what he called the epigenetic principle. Our brain is programmed to develop through these four stages, and the environment helps our brain evolve through these four naturistic stages, these innate stages. We're going to compare him. The guy below me is actually Vygotsky, is Piaget, not Vygotsky. But Vygotsky was different, and then Vygotsky was a nurturist. And you see, his theory emphasizes the importance of human interaction in the development of knowledge. And we're going to talk about two things with Vygotsky: the zone of proximal development and scaffolding. Okay? Now, the zone of proximal development is where your intellectual abilities are at. One of the things I try to do is make this class so it's challenging but not impossible. If I make this class too easy, it's not in your zone of proximal development and you won't get any better. If I make this class too hard, then you'll give up and you won't get any better. So what I try to do is I try to set this class up so it's hard but not impossible. I want it to be at the top of your zone of proximal development. Okay? And then, so if you've ever learned an instrument, you've found that you have to keep trying harder things on your instrument. If you're playing the same thing you already know, you're never going to get better on your instrument. But if you try to play more difficult songs, you will find your ability grows in using that instrument. Same with school, same with your intellectual abilities. But what he suggested, the social part of his theory, was that it's the teacher's job to scaffold the knowledge. And by scaffolding, I just mean help you while you're doing something difficult. Have you ever had somebody help you when you're learning a difficult math concept? Have you ever had somebody help you learn a complex new song? Have you ever had somebody help you learn how to engage in a sports behavior? If you have, then that person has scaffolded your behavior. Okay, and so we're going to talk about the development of our intellectual abilities this semester, and we're going to talk about how nature and our innate qualities and our genetic programming changes it. And then we're also going to talk about how our environment affects the development of our individual abilities. Now, I'm also going to talk a little bit about what we would call the information processing approach. Some people think that Piaget and Vygotsky are as unscientific as Sigmund Freud. So modern cognitive research looks at human brains as computers, and we ask the scientific question: how does your short-term memory, your long-term memory develop? How does your ability to pay attention, to focus, develop? And so we're going to talk about human beings as a developing computer too. So these three ways we're going to talk about how human beings develop. We're going to talk about Piaget's old school theory of humans developing four different mindsets. We're going to talk about Vygotsky and the importance of scaffolding. And then we're going to talk about the human brain as a computer that is developing, okay? So that's sort of the cognitive perspective. So why do people develop the way they do? Well, from a personality standpoint, we can say that Erickson would say our personality develops as we meet and resolve these emotional crises that we have throughout our life. Piaget and Vygotsky would be more interested in our mental development, and they would have different ideas about how our mental abilities develop, right? So we have two theoretical perspectives, one that talks about how personality develops and one that talks about how our intellectual abilities develop. Two different theoretical approaches. Okay, Now, we're also going to talk about behaviorism. Do you folks remember little Albert, the boy who learned how to have a phobia when he was 2 years old? If you're in my class, you remember little Albert. Do you folks ever remember B.F. Skinner and positive, positive reinforcement? Do you remember that? How many of you remember Pavlov's dog salivating when you ring a bell? Do y'all remember that? Those are behavioral strategies. Of course you do, Imani. That I know, right, Andrea? That poor child. How horrible is that? Very good. And John, there you go. This is a very nurturist point of view. In fact, the behaviorist would say that we're all pretty much born the same. So the difference between me and John, between me and Andrea, between Imani and and Shame is all due to the environment we are raised in. And we're going to talk about operant conditioning and classical conditioning. I'm not going to reteach those concepts. You should have learned those in chapter 1. But you know what? We're going to talk about how people develop phobias. We're going to talk about how people's self-confidence, their confidence, is affected by operant conditioning. If you get rewarded or reinforced for the good things that you do as a kid, you may develop a sense of confidence. If your mother or father punishes everything you do, you may learn not to have a sense of self confidence. And we're going to talk about how these early outcomes in life create personality styles. Have any of you ever met a person who has no confidence at all? Have any of you ever met a person who thinks they're bad at everything? On the other hand, have you met somebody who has all kinds of confidence, who is willing to try new things? Okay. Now, what we say is that people early in their life develop personality characteristics based upon the reinforcements and classical conditioning experiences that they have early in life. Yes, we can train people to behave by trick. Absolutely. I taught my son the word no when he was 1 year old. A lot of you would get mad at me when I did it, but you know what? I found that I could use punishment, and I trained him in 2 days how to listen to me. And after those 2 days, my son would listen to me. When I said no, he would stop what he was doing. I didn't have to argue with him. I didn't have to spank him. The word no would magically stop my child. So I used a classical and operant conditioning situation to train my son to obey me. And now we have a wonderful relationship because I don't have to punish him. If I say don't do that, he won't do it. If I say do that, he will do it. Actually, he's a grown man now, so he doesn't listen to much of what I say, but he did. You know what? If you remind me in webinar next week, I will show you how to do it. I swear to God, I can teach you how to have a well-behaved child at the age of 1. If you've ever been around somebody with 4-year-old kids that are terrors, that seem spoiled and throw fits and cause trouble, those parents did not use the Roddenberry technique. But I swear to God, I can train your child up in 2 days. Okay? All right, Imani, we'll talk about that. Maybe you won't want to bring your daughter to that one because this might get kind of traumatic for her. It's not abuse and it's not bad, but it's a quickly way. You know what? Actually, I can teach you how to train that 4-year-old too. So bring that up next week in class. Every time you say no, it's an argument. Right, right. I will tell you exactly. In fact, remind me next week, folks. Let's talk about that. I swear to God, it works like magic. Absolute magic. And people would always say, whenever we go visit them, they'd be like, holy cow, your children are so well behaved. I wish you would take my children and train them. And here's the thing, I didn't have to be abusive. And after that first 2 days, I could be nice as hell to my kids. They would always listen to no. But I'll show you. I'm telling you, some parents think that it's their job to make their child happy all the time, and that's actually problematic. But we'll talk about that later. In fact, you know what? I might even, I might even, uh, your children. Okay, back to the lecture. Okay, your sound. Oh, it does? Okay, I'll fix that. Thank you very much. I've got all these different sets. Sometimes they screw up. But my idea was my soapbox, I'm just going to tell you my opinion. Okay. Now, some people look at animals and try to see if there are similarities between the way animals grow up and humans grow up. And what they're attempting to do is to see if there are any innate, instinctive ways that human beings develop. Now, I didn't mention this in the introductory class. I didn't use the word ethological, but Mary Ainsworth and attachment theory was developed from an ethological perspective. Look at this fellow underneath me. This is Conrad Lorenz. He was a guy who demonstrated for the first time this crazy concept called imprinting. He found that animals will develop a bond with whatever is close to them in the first few days of their life. Typically, it's the mom, so infants bond with the mom. But you know what? If a newborn baby is around a dog or somebody other than their parents, they will develop a close emotional bond to that. We have this instinctual desire to bond to the first thing we see. And so Conrad Lorenz took these geese, these gray lag geese, and when they hatched, he took them away from their mom, put them in a cage, and he would come and feed them every day. He would feed these. Yes, it's an instinct, John. Animals, humans, all mammals have an instinct to bond to the first thing they see. And what Conrad Lorenz found was if he kept these goose away from their mom and he was the only thing they saw for the first few days of their life, these animals would actually bond to him and follow him around. And if you see in this picture right here, he's swimming in the water, and these birds that have imprinted to him are swimming right along behind them. Because to these birds, he's their daddy, because he's the first thing they saw. So this is called imprinting. Now, this research was carried out further in humans, and what Harry Harlow, John Bowlby, and Mary Ainsworth found was that there's a critical period during the first 2 years of your life when you need to be around a caring and supportive parent in order to develop a normal ability to attach with other people. I don't know if you've ever met a person that has difficulty creating and maintaining social bonds as an adult. Some people have trouble finding friends and lovers. These people may have an attachment problem. Maybe their parents weren't nice to them the first couple of years of their life. There's actually a clinical disorder called reactive attachment disorder that occurs sometimes when children are abused during the first 2 years of their life by their primary caregiver. They don't ever develop a bond with their parent, and that causes them to have difficulty developing bonds for the rest of their life. So, over the course of this semester, John and Shimei, we're going to talk about the instinctual forces that create our development. We're going to talk about this mainly with regard to relationships, but we're going to approach the ethological perspective several times during this semester. Okay, now a more sociological theory, we're going to talk about this a little bit, but not much because I'm not a sociologist. The monkey bond was real, absolutely. The monkeys actually bonded to a stuffed animal because that's the only thing they saw the first few months of their life. So these animals developed a close emotional relationship with the stuffed animal. It turns out research has shown, at least in animals, you can't do this with humans, but animals can actually be taught to bond to something that is not living. You can have them bond to a stuffed animal. Actually, Conrad Lorenz even showed that you can get animals to bond to shapes, to triangles or squares, if that's the only thing they see in their cage during the first few days of their life. You put them in a cage, and the only thing they see is a triangle. You wait for about a week or two. If you go in there and scare the animal, it will run over and stand next to the triangle as if the triangle was a caregiver that could make it feel comfortable. It's crazy, but all of us have an instinctual desire to bond to something. And we're going to talk about why and how that happens. Now, a sociological theory, you can also say, you know what? It's not just instinct, it's not just reinforcements and punishment, but we really need to take into account culture and community and all of these other things when describing how people's personality, how people develop. And so we're going to talk a little bit about these forces. One person who sort of wrote a theory that puts all these forces together was a fellow named Uri Bronfenbrenner. He called it his ecological theory. And if you see below me this picture, you see the individual right here. Now, those are the personality factors that cause you to develop. Those are the individual innate factors. But around those individual factors, there's environment and culture and larger circles. So all of us have a microsystem that affects our development. We have a family, we have friends, we have our school. These are all things that are really, really close to us. And these microsystems have relationships between each other. So your parents talk to your school, your friends talk to your parents, your friends are talking to you at school. So all of these little microsystems work together in what he called the mesosystem. And then he talked about the let's focus on the macro system, which is your culture at large. The culture at large, which is the media, which is America, which is whatever country you grew up in. Ronique, remind me again where you were from. It's some Caribbean island, but I can never remember exactly what island. You know, Ronique's culture caused him to develop a little bit differently than me because I'm from Georgia, right? Imani, I think you told me, oh my goodness, you told me you were from somewhere in Africa. Your culture caused you to develop differently than me. The culture that affects us to develop is called our macro system. And then, just like COVID, somebody mentioned COVID earlier, war, civil upheaval, politics, historical things affect our development as well. He called that the chronosystem. Yeah, we are. We're different, but we're similar, Roni. So Bronfenbrenner so at some point, we're actually going to take a look at how culture and history affect who you are as a human being. Okay, so these represent the approaches. So, why do people grow up the way they are? Well, you can say it has to do with the conflicts that they're going through in their life and the bad things that are happening to them. Or you could say, you could focus on how their mind is developed and how they process information, right? Or we can talk about how their parents punish and reinforce them and how their environment shapes their behavior. Or we can talk about the instincts and how our instincts cause us to develop. Or we can telescope out and look at how culture affects our development. So, do you see how each of these theoretical perspectives is just a different opinion on how people do? Yes, yes, absolutely. The ecological theory would definitely be a nurture based theory, Imani. Absolutely. And you know, y'all are bringing up a good point. Yesterday, I talked about the debates that we have in psychology: stage versus continuous, stability versus change, nature versus nurture. If you read, when you learn about these theories, each one of them is going to take slightly different stands on whether or not it's nature or nurture, whether or not we're always changing or always staying the same, and whether or not we evolve like butterflies or whether or not we grow continuously like oak trees. Yes, Imani. So all of these different ecological theories are going to have an opinion in the debate. In fact, when we talk about these debates, nature versus nurture, it occurs probably because people from the behavioral perspective are disagreeing with the ethological perspective. So they're going to have these debate, and the ethological people are going to say, oh, it's instincts. And the behavioral people are going to say, no, it's environment. That's a debate because these two viewpoints are different in what they say is important in understanding human development. Now, I'm going to tell you that they're all important and they all have different things to say about development. But within the context of these theories, they're each going to have arguments and they're going to think the other person is wrong. But we're going to be smart this semester and know that all of these perspectives have some degree of correctness, right? So it's not just nature, it's not just nurture, it's nurture through nature. So your nature sets your baseline, and then your nurture shapes that baseline. Okay? Now, quick statement about research methods in developmental psychology. In developmental psychology, we're measuring change. So it's very important that we measure people over a period of time. And so a lot of developmental research studies do what's called time span research. So they'll use a longitudinal approach, a cross-sectional approach, or a cross-sequential approach. Now, what you can do is you can find the same people and you can follow them for many years. In fact, there's this crazy study over in Europe, over in England, where they went and followed these kids, newborn kids, in the 1940, and they followed these kids since 1940 all the way to today. They've been following these kids for 80 years now. There's a great documentary, if you're interested, called 7 Up. And every 7 years, these filmmakers go back and look at these kids. And you can see these kids develop from 7-year-olds to 14-year-olds to 21-year-olds. This is what's called a longitudinal approach. You can watch the same people and see how they change. Now, the only problem with this is sometimes historical events occur which make this cohort different from all other cohorts. So if you're watching how children's academic ability changes over a longitudinal study, and you've been watching these kids since 2005 and it's now 2022, COVID is something that is unique to this particular cohort. So you can't say that this is how all children develop because there's this historical event that may be unique to this group of students. So the longitudinal approach is one way to measure change, but it does have a problem, what we'll call the history effect. Now, some people get around this longitudinal problem by doing what's known as a cross-sectional approach. Okay, I don't have the time to wait. Exactly, John, exactly. The student observed the child playing with Barbies that weren't allowed in the store without masks. Right, that's not really normal, and that's a function of this COVID pandemic. Good point, John, great point. Now, some people want to get around this history problem, and they don't have 80 years to wait for their data, so they use what's known as a cross-sectional approach. You know what I want to do? I want to see how people change every 7 years. So I'm going to go out this year and find a group of kids who are 7, a group of kids who are 14, a group of kids who are 21, and a group of adults who are 28. And I'm going to measure them all at the exact same time. Now, I'm not measuring the same people, but I am measuring groups of people at different ages. And so this is one way of seeing how people change as they get older. The only problem is that there are cohort effects. My generation's different than your generation. Your generation is going to be different than your children who are growing up. So sometimes cohorts are different. So it's hard to say that if I'm measuring 7-year-olds and 21-year-olds now, there may be some historical events that have caused these cohorts to be different. Yes, generations, you're right, Ronnie. Now, the cool thing, we know a lot about the change of adult. One of the cool studies done on how IQ and intellectual abilities change as we grow up. Exactly. Yes, yes, yes. We've created a new cohort in the pandemic. You could be compared to the effects that occurred because of smallpox or the Spanish flu. Right. That's a good point. But you know what? When the Spanish flu occurred, there was no internet, Andrea. So yes, we both had pandemics, but we have internet. They don't have internet. I like the way you're thinking, Andrea. You are definitely thinking. And this is kind of what developmental psychologists do. They find these similarities. Brilliant point, Andrea. Brilliant point. Now, The Seattle Longitudinal Study of Cognitive Development is the study, whenever people tell you how our mental abilities change in older adulthood, the data they are talking about comes from the Seattle Longitudinal Study of Cognitive Development in Adulthood. And these people did what's called a cross-sequential approach. So in this study, they went out and found some 7-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 21-year-olds, 28-year-olds, 35-year-olds, just like a cross-sectional approach. But then they followed each of these groups as they got older, just like a longitudinal approach. So a cross-sequential approach is a longitudinal study smushed up with a cross-sectional approach. And this allows you to tease out history effects and cohort effects as well, okay? So a cross-sequential approach is seen as sort of a better alternative to either a longitudinal or a cross-sectional approach, okay? And each of these are different ways to measure change over a period of time. These are some examples of cohorts, not going to talk about them, but if anybody wants to know what a cohort is, here we go, the COVID pandemic, the silent generation, baby boomers, Generation X, and you crazy old millennials. Okay, you know what? That's all I have to say today. It is 10:51, so we are just at the perfect ending time. I didn't go over today and I didn't run short. Anybody have any questions? By the way, I want to compliment you on all your comments in the chat bars. Thank you very much for participating in the chat. I could tell you're really engaged, and I really do appreciate that. You're absolutely awesome. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat bar, so I'm going to go ahead and log off. If you do have questions, as usual, you can send me a text or an email, and I will get back with you super duper quick. Remember, the part 1 of your first discussion board is due tonight. If you're going to try to get extra credit or just do your collaboration this way, you need to make sure you make your first comment by tonight at 11:59 p.m. Okay, is there a way to test ourselves to see where we fall in the cognitive area? You know what? That's such a broad question that I don't know. If you talk to me specifically of what cognitive area, John, we could talk about it, yes. But there are definitely ways that I could look at how you are specifically, where you are at in your development. Yeah, I could do that, John. Ronique, what's your question, buddy? Comparing ourselves to our own cohort. Yes, you can compare yourself to your own cohort, but when you do that, you're just looking at individual differences and you're not looking necessarily at how people change as they get older. I mean, we can measure your cohort as they change, but I have to keep in mind that your cohort is different than my cohort, which is different than my dad's cohort. So developmental may be the same for all cohorts, but it might be different for some cohorts too. You've answered it? Okay, cool. All right, folks, you take care. It's been an absolutely great day, and I thank you very much for coming to lecture. Have a good day and try to be productive and happy today. Take care.